On 11 June 1944, at Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands, the communications deck of the U.S. fast carrier force hummed with the background hiss of radio interference. Encoded transmissions, stripped of static by decrypt operators, were relayed upward through the command chain until they became the operational blueprint for the next phase of the Central Pacific Campaign. The directive was concise, but immense in scope. Operation Forager was to begin. The fleet was to advance toward the Mariana Islands, seize control of the air above Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and remain prepared for the inevitable counterstrike from the remaining Japanese carrier arm. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, after scanning the horizon with his binoculars, briefed his operations staff on the scale of the armada under his command. 15 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers formed the core of Task Force 58, a massive naval aviation unmatched in global history to that point. Although the officers understood the gravity of the coming campaign, none could foresee that this single thrust toward the Marianas would culminate in the most destructive carrier engagement ever fought, one that would shatter Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. American strategic planners had learned through years of bitter fighting that the aircraft carrier was not simply a ship that happened to carry airplanes. It was the decisive instrument of modern sea control. Air dominance meant maritime dominance, and maritime dominance meant the ability to reach across the Pacific, distances once thought insurmountable for offensive operations against Japan. The Essex-Class carriers, arriving in numbers only American industry could sustain, formed the backbone of this new reality. Task Force 58 surged westward at roughly 25 knots, its Essex-Class carriers pushing aside more than 27,000 tons of seawater at standard displacement. Each vessel extended over 870 feet and measured 93 feet across the beam. From the flag bridge of the USS Lexington, Mitcher observed a battle formation dispersed over nearly 40 miles of ocean. His contingent included 7 of the powerful Essex-Class ships: Essex, Yorktown, Hornet, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Lexington, and Enterprise, supported by 8 light carriers of the Independence class, among them Below Wood, Bataan, Monterey, Cabot, San Jacinto, Princeton, Langley, and Cowpens. A single Essex-Class vessel carried a crew of about 3,400 men and an air group typically organized into 4 squadrons: F-6F Hellcat fighters, SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo aircraft, totaling around 90 planes. Their design allowed remarkably rapid flight operations. 4 aircraft elevators could shift planes between decks in under a minute, and deck crews could launch aircraft at intervals of roughly half a minute during high-tempo operations. Mitcher's chief of staff, Captain R. Lee Burke, a naval thinker with a background in law and a reputation for rigorous analysis, reduced carrier warfare to a series of time and distance calculations. Launch sequences, recovery windows, fuel endurance, payload management. In his view, entire battles could turn on the tight management of minutes and miles. Across the Philippine Sea, aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa reviewed his own orders for Operation Eigo, Japan's effort to halt the American advance. Taiho, the pride of the Imperial Navy, displaced more than 29,000 tons and embarked approximately 75 aircraft. It featured an armored flight deck, an uncommon luxury in Japanese carrier design, intended to endure hits from medium-weight bombs. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers, comprising roughly 430 aircraft, Japan's last attempt to assemble a concentrated strike force. Among them were the veteran carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, survivors of the early war years, joined by the fleet carriers Junyo and Hiyo, and the lighter carriers Ryo, Chisoda, and Chiyoda. But this impressive list concealed a critical weakness. By mid-1944, the quality of Japan's naval aviators, once the envy of the world, had plummeted due to heavy losses, inadequate training pipelines, and fuel shortages that restricted flight hours. The disparity in pilot readiness would become one of the decisive factors in the massive carrier clash that loomed ahead. By the summer of 1944, The contrast between American and Japanese naval aviation could hardly have been sharper. Aviators who had defended Pearl Harbor typically arrived in combat with more than 700 flight hours, while the air crews serving aboard Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carriers often possessed fewer than 275 hours and in numerous cases barely exceeded 100 hours in total experience. Years of relentless losses, not training shortages alone, had hollowed out Japan's once formidable naval air arm. The Imperial Navy had sacrificed over 400 veteran flyers at Midway, another 250 during the battles of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, and still more throughout the grueling Solomon Islands campaign. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. The attrition curve itself had become a decisive weapon against Japan. As U.S. forces advanced toward the Marianas in early June, the American fast carrier force organized itself into 4 distinct elements. Task Group 58.1, led by Rear Admiral Joseph Jocko Clark, included Hornet, Yorktown, Belleau Wood, and Bataan. Task Group 58.2, commanded by Rear Admiral Alfred Montgomery, brought Bunker Hill, Wasp, Monterey, and Cabot. Task Group 58.3, under Rear Admiral John Reeves, centered around Enterprise, Lexington, San Jacinto, and Princeton. The final formation, Task Group 58.4, headed by Rear Admiral William Harrell, fielded Essex, Langley, and Cowpens. Together, they constituted the most powerful carrier striking force yet assembled. At 1300 on 11 June, the opening fighter sweep launched from the Essex-Class carriers and drove westward toward Japanese strongholds in the Marianas. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading VF-15 from USS Essex, took 32 F-6H Hellcats toward Oslido Airfield on Saipan. The Hellcat itself embodied the philosophy underlying the Essex-Class carriers, dominance achieved through reliable engineering and overwhelming industrial production. Built around the robust 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the aircraft could push nearly 380 miles per hour and claw its way to 20,000 feet in roughly 7 minutes. Aboard Essex, radar operator First Class James Chen followed the outbound fighters on the ship's SK Air Search Radar, a system capable of spotting incoming aircraft up to 100 miles away and at altitudes reaching 30,000 feet. Operators like Chen rotated the antenna, paused to examine returns sector by sector, and continuously calculated bearings and ranges to build a coherent picture of the skies around the task force. Japan's air defense network in the Marianas nominally contained about 500 aircraft, though operational readiness was scarcely half that number. At 1335, Brewer's formation met the first Japanese response, roughly 30 Mitsubishi A6M-Zeros rising to challenge the American fighters. Once revolutionary, the Zero had fallen behind the pace of the war. Its maximum speed of 331 miles an hour, slower climb to 20,000 feet, nearly 9.5 minutes, and complete absence of pilot armor or self-sealing fuel tanks now left it severely outclassed. More damaging still was the inexperience of its pilots. Many had logged fewer than 200 hours, and a considerable portion, not even half of that.
The encounter devolved rapidly into a rout. By the end of the day, Japanese aviation had lost 147 airplanes, while U.S. forces reported only 11 fighters missing. Commander David McCampbell, head of Air Group 15 aboard Essex, later described the imbalance as like striking helpless prey. Japanese formations broke apart easily, their firing was inaccurate, and their radio coordination veered between chaotic and non-existent. Meanwhile, Japanese naval intelligence teams monitoring American communications from Tawi began to recognize the scale of the U.S. offensive. Urgent signals were dispatched to Admiral Ozawa, ordering the mobile fleet to depart immediately and initiate Operation Go, the long-planned effort to deliver a decisive blow. The concept depended on shore-based aircraft in the Marianas, damaging the American carriers first, creating an opportunity for Ozawa's carrier groups to finish them off. On 13 June, cryptanalysts at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific intercepted and decoded Japanese operational messages revealing these intentions. They pieced together a clear outline. The mobile fleet would sail from Tawi-Tawi, replenish in the Philippine Sea, and then strike directly at the American forces supporting the assault on Saipan. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, made the pivotal decision that would define the coming battle. Instead of chasing Ozawa westward, he ordered Task Force 58 to remain positioned near the amphibious landing zones, compelling the Japanese to move east into the waiting American defenses. On USS Yorktown, Executive Officer John Williamson worked through the tactical geometry, fully aware that Japanese carrier aircraft possessed greater range than their American counterparts. That fact shaped the engagement area, and soon, the skies of the Philippine Sea would determine the fate of both navies. Japanese carrier aircraft of the era, Zero fighters as well as the Kate and Val types, could remain in the air for nearly 2,000 miles on internal fuel alone. By comparison, U.S. Navy carrier planes such as the F-6F Hellcat, SB-2C Helldiver, and TBF Avenger operated with far more limited combat radii, generally between 270 and 340 miles. On paper, this meant that Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa possessed the ability to launch offensive strikes from distances the American fast carriers could not easily match. Yet Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance's staff recognized a reality the Japanese command had not fully grasped. Modern carrier engagements were determined less by raw aircraft range and far more by an integrated network of sensors, communication methods, and defensive systems. American task forces benefited from a suite of capabilities that the Imperial Navy had not countered. Carrier-based radar providing early warning, centralized fighter direction operations, improved anti-aircraft fire supported by proximity-fused ammunition, and highly disciplined shipboard damage control procedures. Within this broader system, the Essex-Class carriers demonstrated strengths that overshadowed their sole weakness in aircraft endurance. At 9:30 p.m. on 18 June 1944, the submarine USS Kavala made initial contact with the Japanese mobile fleet roughly 360 miles west-southwest of Saipan. Over the next several hours, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler maintained a shadowing position and transmitted detailed position reports. These reached Spruance's command by roughly 0300 on the 19th, informing the Americans that the enemy was approaching from the west, apparently unaware that their location had been compromised. Dawn on 19th June arrived with conditions nearly ideal for large-scale carrier flight operations: high visibility extending 40 miles, unrestricted cloud ceiling, steady easterly winds of about 14 knots, and moderate seas with long Pacific swells. Under such circumstances, the stage was set for what would become the most expansive carrier battle ever fought. Around 7:30 a.m., air search radar aboard USS Yorktown detected the first inbound Japanese strike group, approximately 69 aircraft approaching from the west at an altitude near 18,000 feet. Lieutenant Joseph Eggard, serving as fighter direction officer, began issuing vectors that guided combat air patrol Hellcats toward the attackers. The F-6F-3s, each armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns carrying substantial ammunition loads, climbed to an advantageous intercept position. Among the first Americans to make contact was Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu of USS Lexington, already a recognized ace.
He later recalled astonishment at the rigid formation maintained by the Japanese pilots who flew without evasive action or mutual support. In a brief but intense engagement lasting only minutes, Vrasiu downed 6 aircraft, adding to the heavy losses imposed on the strike force. Out of the original 69 planes, 42 were destroyed before they could approach the American task group. Meanwhile, at 9:10 a.m., the submarine USS Albacore launched a spread of torpedoes at the Japanese flagship Taiho from about 5,000 yards. One torpedo penetrated the carrier's aviation fuel handling system, causing volatile gasoline vapors to accumulate deep within the hull. Damage control personnel attempting to clear the fumes inadvertently activated ventilation settings that spread the vapor further throughout the ship, an error that would eventually doom the carrier. A second and larger Japanese strike group, 128 aircraft, approached near 10 o'clock. Hellcats once again intercepted the formation, this time approximately 60 miles from the American carriers. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading Fighter Squadron 15 from USS Essex, reported that the attackers flew with little coordination and made no serious attempt to resist interception. 97 aircraft from this wave were destroyed in the air.
American ships supplemented fighter defense with dense anti-aircraft fire. Mark 37 directors, combined with radar range finding, enabled gunners to place rapid, accurate barrages around the task force. Newly issued proximity-fused shells detonated automatically when passing within lethal distance of enemy planes, creating an appearance, according to surviving Japanese aviators, of a continuous barrier of explosions surrounding each carrier group. Shortly after midday, around 12:20, USS Kavala attacked again, this time launching torpedoes at the seasoned carrier Shokaku. Several hits tore through the hull. Although Captain Hiroshi Matsubara ordered counterflooding and attempted corrective measures, the structural damage and fires spreading through the ship proved overwhelming. The carrier was fatally stricken within hours, marking the loss of yet another cornerstone of the Japanese carrier arm. Earlier that day, the Japanese had committed a third major strike. 47 aircraft, launched at 1,000, reached the American fast carrier groups around 1,300. Only 7 aircrews made it back. One of the few pilots to return, Ensign Kanayoshi Muto, later recalled that American fighters swarmed them from every direction, executing well-coordinated attacks that left the Japanese formation effectively defenseless. Still unaware of the devastating losses his air groups were suffering, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa ordered yet another large sortie. 82 planes dispatched at 11:30. Faulty radio links and navigation mistakes fragmented the strike force. 33 aircraft wandered north and found no enemy vessels. The remaining 49 encountered Task Group 58.2, where U.S. Navy Hellcats tore into the formation, downing 30 aircraft in barely 12 minutes. At 14:52, catastrophe struck the carrier Taiho. Gasoline fumes, which had been accumulating since the morning damage, ignited in a massive internal blast. The explosion literally cracked the ship's hull structure, dooming the carrier and killing 1,650 personnel, including most of Ozawa's air staff. Ozawa himself escaped and transferred his flag to the cruiser Haguro, but coordinated command of the mobile fleet effectively collapsed.
By nightfall on 19 June, Japan had committed 373 carrier aircraft. Only 130 managed to return to their decks. American losses in air-to-air fighting amounted to 29 planes, with most aviators recovered, a kill ratio surpassing 10-to-1, the most one-sided air combat outcome of the entire Second World War. The U.S. advantage stemmed largely from pilot experience. American flyers routinely accumulated 300 to 500 hours before joining carrier units, while their opponents often entered battle with far fewer. The following afternoon, at 15:40 on 20 June, Scouts from USS Enterprise located Ozawa's retreating carriers approximately 275 miles west-northwest of Task Force 58. The distance exceeded the normal operating radius for American aircraft, and returning after sunset, a procedure strongly discouraged in carrier doctrine, would be unavoidable. Nevertheless, Admiral Mitcher recognized that this was likely the last viable opportunity to break Japanese naval aviation for good. At 1621, Mitcher issued his famous order, "Launch everything you can." Within 10 minutes, 11 carriers had surged 240 aircraft into the air, 85 Hellcats, 77 dive bombers, and 54 torpedo aircraft. Pilots were warned that fuel margins were razor-thin. Any unnecessary maneuvering could doom them on the return flight. Addressing his strike group from Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander James "Jig Dog" Ramage laid out the stark reality. Their survival depended on strict fuel discipline, lean mixtures, conservative throttle settings, and a single attack run before turning directly back toward the task force. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the American carrier groups located the Japanese formation and struck before darkness fully set in. In the dim glow of evening, torpedo squadrons from Belleau Wood closed in on the carrier Ho, a vessel that had begun life as a civilian liner and whose internal compartmentalization was never suited for heavy combat damage. Multiple torpedo impacts tore into her hull, and within roughly 2 hours, she slipped beneath the surface, taking about 250 sailors with her. Nearby, the carriers Zuikaku and Chiyoda, along with the battleship Haruna, suffered varying levels of damage during the same series of attacks. The journey back to the American task force proved nearly as dramatic as the battle itself. As night settled over the Pacific, returning pilots were forced to navigate vast stretches of ocean with dwindling fuel reserves and only the faintest visual cues. Several aviators were compelled to put their aircraft down beside escorting destroyers as their engines sputtered out. Others reached the general area of the task force but were unable to identify their own carriers in the darkness. At 2045, Vice Admiral Mitcher issued what would soon become one of the most famous commands in naval aviation history. He ordered the entire task force to illuminate itself. Instantly, every ship in Task Force 58 switched on its lights. Searchlights shot upward, running lights and deck outlines blazed with intensity. Illumination rounds burst above the formation, turning the night into a patchwork of shifting brightness. For roughly 2 hours, aircraft touched down wherever a landing signal officer could guide them, many landing on ships other than their own. Although about 80 aircraft were ultimately lost, the majority of their pilots were recovered. The price had been high, but the strategic outcome was decisive. Japan's ability to wage carrier warfare had been irreparably broken. By the first light of June 21, the magnitude of Japan's defeat was unmistakable. In just 48 hours of fighting, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 3 major carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hiyo, and between 476 and 600 aircraft, including shore-based units. Roughly 445 aircrew were killed. The few surviving aviators who managed to return to Vice Admiral Ozawa's remaining ships lacked the proficiency or combat seasoning required for meaningful offensive action. American losses, though not insignificant, were far lighter: 123 aircraft destroyed and 76 aircrew killed. More importantly, Task Force 58 still fielded more than 750 serviceable aircraft, flown by pilots whose training pipeline remained robust. U.S. naval aviation programs were producing around 2,000 new aviators each month, each typically receiving 500 hours of flight instruction, including extensive time in frontline aircraft. Advanced syllabi covered radar-assisted interception, instrument procedures, and night operations, skills increasingly essential in the Pacific War. Japan, by contrast, was no longer capable of training aircrews to comparable standards.
Chronic fuel shortages restricted flying hours, and experienced instructors had been reassigned to combat units, leaving novices to be rushed through programs offering 100 to 150 total hours, sometimes less than 50 hours in operational aircraft. Many graduates could manage only basic flight tasks, far short of the competence needed for modern aerial combat. Commander David McCampbell, who would eventually become the U.S. Navy's top-scoring ace with 34 victories, later reflected on these mismatched conditions and emphasized their overwhelming tactical consequences. By the middle of 1944, the American fleet was no longer contending with the same Japanese naval air arm that had struck Pearl Harbor. The experienced aviators who had carried out that attack were almost entirely gone, lost through years of attrition. In their place stood hastily trained youngsters who often lacked even fundamental flying proficiency. Against them, the U.S. Navy deployed the Essex-Class carriers, industrial products in the truest sense, built to sustain a tempo of operations that Japan's depleted industry and shrinking pilot corps could not hope to match. Detailed examination of carrier performance data during this period revealed just how formidable these ships had become. An Essex-class vessel could send an entire strike package of roughly 40 aircraft airborne in about a dozen minutes, then retrieve returning squadrons in a little over a quarter of an hour. Within 45 minutes, crews could refuel, rearm, and prepare planes for another launch cycle. In purely theoretical terms, a single ship could generate 3 full offensive waves in the space of 4 hours. When 15 of these carriers maneuvered together under the banner of Task Force 58, they possessed the ability to unleash nearly 600 aircraft on a chosen target at once, an aerial mass that no remaining Japanese formation could withstand.
The Battle of the Philippine Sea made this imbalance impossible to ignore. In its aftermath, senior Japanese officers reached stark conclusions. Admiral Toyota acknowledged that the first mobile fleet had been effectively stripped of its power to conduct offensive operations, its reservoir of trained aviators exhausted beyond quick repair. The search for substitutes, what he called alternative methods, would soon take shape in the tragic emergence of organized suicide attacks later that autumn. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, retrieved after the sinking of Taiho, filed his own report on June 24. He described American radar-guided interceptions as essentially flawless and noted that U.S. fighter pilots displayed overwhelming superiority in maneuvering, gunnery, and tactical coordination. According to his assessment, most Japanese strike attempts were neutralized before their aircraft could come within meaningful attack distance. His conclusion was blunt. The air groups of the mobile fleet had collapsed as a viable fighting force. Even as these events unfolded, American shipyards were demonstrating the power of standardized mass production. By June 1944, 7 Essex-class carriers were already in service, and 17 more were progressing down the ways. At Newport News, workers had refined construction techniques to the point that a new carrier emerged every 6 months, with the total build time reduced to roughly 14 months through modular assembly and interchangeable components. Technological advances widened the gulf even further. U.S. radar installations could detect incoming aircraft at ranges approaching 100 miles and determine their altitude with impressive precision. The Mark 37 fire control system, paired with the Mark 12 radar, tracked targets at distances exceeding 40,000 yards. Proximity, or VT fuses, an innovation Japan could not match, multiplied the lethality of American anti-aircraft fire several-fold. Meanwhile, the growing sophistication of combat information centers allowed each ship to integrate sensors, weapons, and communications into a coordinated defensive network. The Essex-class also embodied lessons extracted from earlier wartime experiences.
Overhauled ventilation designs reduced the buildup of explosive fumes, while highly trained damage control teams enabled vessels such as USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill to survive catastrophic hits that would likely have doomed carriers of earlier generations. By the summer of 1944, the cumulative effect of these industrial capabilities, technological advantages, and operational refinements had become unmistakable. Japan no longer possessed the means, material or human, to challenge American carrier power in conventional air warfare.
Japan's technological base in the later stages of the Pacific War remained effectively locked in the early 1940s. Aircraft development had stagnated. The Zero, which had startled foreign observers at the outset of the conflict, saw only superficial upgrades rather than true redesigns. Radar equipment was crude, inconsistent, and often failed under operational conditions. Radio sets and other communication systems were outdated. Above all, Japan's industrial network lacked the capacity, both in materials and manufacturing flexibility, to absorb battlefield lessons and translate them into improved weaponry or new generations of aircraft. These limitations were mirrored in the contrasting training systems of the two navies. The United States Navy oversaw a vast instructional infrastructure, operating more than a dozen aviation bases and maintaining an enormous fleet of training aircraft. Pilot output exceeded frontline losses several times over. American aviators moved through a carefully sequenced training pipeline, beginning with basic flight instruction and progressing through increasingly complex phases that included aerial gunnery, navigation, formation tactics, and ultimately operational training with frontline aircraft. Importantly, the system continuously refreshed itself. Seasoned combat pilots were returned to training centers where their real-world experience was rapidly integrated into updated lesson plans and flight manuals. Japan's situation deteriorated in precisely the opposite direction. As the war intensified and fuel shortages became acute, the once-renowned Yokaran program, responsible for producing elite naval aviators before 1942, was drastically compressed. Instruction was reduced to fundamental flying skills, while advanced combat practice was either curtailed or abandoned. New pilots received little exposure to formation discipline, aerial marksmanship, or long-range navigation. In effect, Japan began sending barely prepared airmen into battles that demanded the very expertise they had not been taught. The consequences became brutally evident. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, roughly 450 Japanese aircrew were lost. Many of these men were among the dwindling core of veterans who possessed over a year of operational experience. Their deaths represented the collapse of accumulated knowledge. Carrier procedures, tactical improvisation, and the intangible instincts honed through combat were extinguished in a single campaign. The remaining pilots, often young and undertrained, lacked the expertise needed to instruct replacements or to devise new methods suited to increasingly desperate conditions. The United States, meanwhile, preserved its institutional memory through deliberate personnel policies. Combat tours were finite, ensuring that skilled aviators were not lost through attrition alone. Squadrons were structured so that rookies learned alongside seasoned flyers, and after serving on the front lines, experienced pilots were funneled back into the training system. This continuous circulation of knowledge proved as decisive as advances in production, logistics, or aircraft design. By the time the Imperial Japanese Navy launched its final major operation at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the carrier arm that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor had effectively ceased to exist. Its aircraft, its trained pilots, and the sophisticated operational culture that had enabled early victories were gone, replaced by hollow formations unable to recover from years of technological stagnation and the irreversible collapse of their training pipeline.
When Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa advanced with 4 carriers assigned as a diversionary contingent, the ships he commanded were, in effect, already forfeited. Their air groups, numbering barely over 100 aircraft and staffed largely by inadequately prepared crews, had little prospect of offering meaningful resistance. What unfolded near Cape Engano was less a contest of naval aviation than the deliberate destruction of a force sent to draw fire. American carrier pilots eliminated all 4 Japanese carriers, suffering only minor losses, 10 aircraft, in the process. Although the Essex-Class carriers would continue to project American naval power across the Pacific for the remainder of the war, the decisive blow they struck in these operations had already reshaped the strategic landscape. In the span of 48 hours during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they accomplished what years of costly engagements had struggled to achieve: the near-total elimination of Japan's capability to wage carrier-based air warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz later summarized the results with typical restraint, yet the implications were unmistakable. The Essex-Class carriers and their air wings embodied the strengths of the United States wartime system, an approach rooted in industrial efficiency, technological adaptation, and the disciplined training of large numbers of aircrew. These advantages produced a combat mechanism that Japan simply could not equal or mitigate. The battle's outcome represented not only a triumph in tactics, but also a vindication of the American model of modern industrialized warfare. The repercussions of this achievement extended well past the Second World War. A total of 24 Essex-Class carriers reached completion, going on to serve prominently in later conflicts, including the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and many remained active into the 1970s. One vessel, USS Lexington, which fought in the Philippine Sea, continued in service until 1991. Its remarkable longevity underscored the durability and forward-thinking design philosophy that had transformed naval operations in the mid-20th century. Far below the surface of the Pacific, the wrecks of several Japanese carriers still lie where they sank, their abandoned aircraft resting in silent hangars, and the remnants of their squadrons frozen in their final moments. These wrecks mark the end of a period when naval aviation depended heavily on elite skill and individual daring. As Executive Officer Williamson had once recognized, the determining force in this new era was not courage alone, but mathematics, the overwhelming arithmetic of industrial production, standardized training, and rapid technological development. The triumph of the Essex-Class carriers thus signaled a profound shift. Naval air power was no longer dominated by small groups of highly specialized aviators. It now belonged to nations capable of orchestrating warfare as an immense industrial enterprise. In this emerging reality, outcomes were shaped not by personal heroism, but by manufacturing output, training systems, logistical capacity, and engineering innovation. Through their construction in American shipyards and their operation by citizen sailors drawn from across the United States, the Essex-Class carriers redefined what naval warfare would look like for generations to come. They demonstrated unequivocally that the future of maritime conflict would be determined by industrial democracies able to mobilize technology, manpower, and production on a scale unprecedented in human history.